Hello, this is Scott Wells for themagicwordpodcast.com. This week's episode is brought to you again by the Friends of the Magic Word. To find out more about how that you can support our podcast, please go to themagicwordpodcast.com, and there you will see how that you can support us with your donation or ongoing pledge. We thank you very much for helping us and keep this podcast going week after week. We are nearly approaching 600 episodes, and this week we have another very interesting guest, and I know that from time to time that I have suggested to you some books to read, and that's what we're going to be doing here this week then as well, in which we're going to be talking with the author of a book. It's called Master of Deception. It's written by John Ivan Palmer, who is the son of Jack Pyle, and Jack Pyle was a magician who had toured the country back in the 40s and 50s, 60s, 70s, and he was also a member of the Chicago Magic Roundtable. Kind of in his later years had stayed in the Chicago area. For the longest time, they were traveling on the road, and that's really what this book is about John's growing up in the back seat of the car and in their mobile home, basically, that the trailer that they pulled behind them, and how they lived in all these different parks and all the people that his father, Jack Pyle, had worked with, and also the enigma, I guess, that was Jack Pyle and what drove him to do what he was doing. And from time to time that he would be leaving Jack and his mother. That is, well, they called Jack Jr., I guess, but John Ivan Palmer, that Jack Pyle would leave them and go and do some shows and come back. And so anyhow, this is an interesting tale about history and what it was like to actually be on the road. And the reason I mention the name Jack Pyle, because as you're reading the book, it's not really clear. It doesn't talk a lot about it. It doesn't mention the name Jack Pyle. He refers to his father as being the master of deception and the type of act that he did and all the travels that they had. But again, this is really more of an autobiography of Jack Pyle's son, and I think it's about halfway into the book wherever I actually first remember seeing the name Jack Pyle show up. But I knew in advance that was what we were going to be reading, and so this is a book that tells you a lot of the backstories and about how that Jack Jr. grew up and was touring in the back of the car. I say touring, he was riding in the back of the car, and how that he went from one school to another, how he had learned and how he grew up. And so these are the stories of his youth as he had grown. In our conversation towards the end, I had asked John Palmer whether that his dad, Jack Pyle, had actually belonged to the Chicago Magic Roundtable, and he was uncertain. I've done some research and found out that, yes, he was very involved with that. And there were things about Jack Pyle's life that are not included in this book, and we talk about here in this podcast then as well, about him working in trade shows as well as other kinds of venues. Well, please stick around towards the end of this podcast, because the publisher of this book, Master of Deception, and the name of the publisher, by the way, is called Rare Bird, and Rare Bird has given us a couple of books that we are offering then as prizes. So thank you, Rare Bird, and thank you, John Ivan Palmer. And I also want to thank you, John, for agreeing to be on here this week so that we can talk about your book. Please welcome John Ivan Palmer, the author of Master of Deception, here this week on The Magic Word. Well, today I have with me a person who actually is another author, and I like to feature authors from time to time who actually have something interesting to bring to our community. And I mean, there are plenty of books with new tricks that are coming out all the time, and DVDs, etc. But also there are some books about history which are quite interesting and entertaining then as well, and that are biographies or autobiographies of certain individuals. But one came to my attention here recently that is called Master of Deception by John Ivan Palmer, and I thought this would merit your interest because it's someone perhaps who may not be as well known to you, and it's interesting about sort of the background that he goes into in the book. So let me first of all just welcome and say hello to John. Hey, John, how are you today?
Oh, I'm just fine, Scott. Thank you.
I'm glad that you're here with us then today, and pretty fascinating tale as far as what you've gotten into. And just before we get started, early on before we kind of start recording this, I'd asked you about your name, John Ivan, which is hyphenated, John Ivan Palmer, and last name being Palmer as opposed to Pyle, which Jack Pyle is your father's name, who ultimately we're going to be talking about, who is a magician. So how did it come to John Ivan? You said it was like a Russian name?
Well, yeah, first of all, when I decided to start doing magic, I never had any interest in performing on stage or any knowledge of magic aside from what my father did, and I knew what he did quite well since I grew up with his act and put away his props and everything. So I just copied his act word for word. I was just a carbon copy, a Xerox copy of what he did. And since we both have the same name, he's John Pyle or Jack Pyle, and my name was John. One of us had to change our name because one was the original and the other was a cheap knockoff. So I was the one elected to change the name. So when I had my first publicity pictures taken, I had his initials. I borrowed his shirt, and his initials were monogrammed on the cuff, JP. So I had to come up with a name that had the initials JP. And first it was Johnny Palmer, then John Palmer. And that sounded a little bit too ordinary. So I picked a number of names that were a little different. Some of them were Russian, taken from Russian literature. And others were variations of that. So I came up with a number of names. One of them was John Ivan Palmer, with the first two names hyphenated. And then I went around to 2 university campuses and stopped 100 students at each campus, 50 males, 50 females, and had them circle the name that attracted their attention first. And the overwhelming majority of them circled John Ivan Palmer. So that's who you're talking to now.
Well, that is an interesting story about how to come up with a stage name, certainly, of actually doing some research physically and asking people. I mean, of course, now you'd have the advantage of the Internet, I guess, and a lot of people do send out pictures, and they'll say, do you like picture 1 or 2, or do you like this name or that name? But back, I guess, when you were doing this, we didn't have that convenience of Facebook.
Yeah, right. There was no Internet, no cell phones, not even any answering machines, actually. I mean, they were there.
Yeah, the times that you're talking about in the book, I think, are quite interesting, certainly, and going back to times, really, I think, whenever that it was a transition from the old tent shows, like with Willard the Wizard, kind of a thing. When you were young and being brought up and going around then, and the little kind of an Airstream trailer. It wasn't really an Airstream. What was the model?
It was a Travelo, which was a late 1940s, pre-war or post-war, early post-war, very cheap trailer, very primitive. There was no toilet, no shower or anything. So that's all we could afford. So that's what we pulled around for quite a number of years.
Yeah, and it sounds interesting about how that you were trying to find different places, of course, where that you could actually park the trailer, so that way that you would have access then to conveniences like electricity and toilet and running water.
Right. Well, at that time, right after World War II, in late 40s, early 50s, there were many tens of thousands of people living in trailers because there was not much housing after World War II and all the GIs returned. Mm-hmm. And so you would see trailers everywhere. Trailer parks were full. New ones were going up all the time. If you couldn't find a place in a trailer park, oftentimes you'd park behind a gas station or in a farmer's barnyard or even just on the street. And that's what we had to do a number of times. It's certainly nice if you can have access to a washroom and electricity hookup, but a lot of times we didn't have that luxury.
Well, of course, then when you were a child, that you were playing with whatever friends you happened to meet that day or that week, and so you probably didn't care about taking a bath as a kid so much as your parents did.
Yeah, having fun and mostly just being out of the car and being able to run around was a big luxury to me because I spent most of my time in the back seat of a car with the animal cages right next to me. It wasn't even a seat. First thing my father did when he bought a new car was to throw the back seat away. so he could fit in the props and the wardrobe and the rabbit cage. And then I had a little spot on the floor next to that, and that's where I spent a lot of my time. And so it was very confining.
Yeah, I remember you mentioning one of the stories about where that there was a black gentleman who was a dancer and everything, and the two of you were sitting in the back seat without any seat, and that's where the cages were and everything. And I was trying to imagine that you're just sitting on the floor, him entertaining you.
That's right, Teddy Qualls, the real live Scandinavian folk dancer. Yeah, he rode with us sometimes, and as well as other acts, because being a lone black man at that time in history out in the boondocks of America could be problematic. He would sometimes have trouble with the police because he was not a good driver, and he would get stopped for one thing or another. Mm-hmm. Also, he sometimes had trouble getting served in a restaurant, but if he came in with us, there was no problem. Or if we stayed at a hotel and he came in with us, there'd be no problem. But if he came in by himself, he would often be turned away, sometimes from the very places that hired him. And then they'd call the agent and, work out, the problem so he could get in and do his act.
I'd heard stories about that, like that, about even Sammy Davis Jr., about places once he still had a big name, that he was not allowed to be in some of the same hotels where the rest of the Rat Pack would be. And Frank Sinatra said, basically, if you don't have him with us, then you don't have all of us, basically.
That's a very, very common story. And we did the same thing with Teddy Qualls. If they wouldn't let him stay in the hotel, then all the other acts would just check out.
Mm-hmm. Oh, interesting.
Somewhere else.
Yeah. In writing this book, let me kind of go back, I guess, to the beginning. Why it was that, what was it about your father or your story that you felt that you wanted to give to the world? And had you written a book before? This isn't your first one, as I recall.
No, I wrote a novel prior to this one. And that was a number of years ago. It was also about being on the fringes. It was about male burlesque dancers.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's unusual.
Yeah, pretty unusual.
You mean not like drag people?
No, male strippers.
Huh, okay, gotcha.
And it was a satire of gender roles in America. Certainly not your ordinary narrative. And the same thing with Master of Deception. It's also not your ordinary narrative either. It deals with living on the fringes and being an outsider, and the kind of reality that some people live that's in a parallel reality with everyone else, but yet they're completely unknown. People like my father, who were working variety acts during the 50s, was quite a large population of people, and there was a large industry that booked them at venues all over the country, whether they were nightclubs, fairs, hotels, banquets, fraternal organizations. At any one night in any one city, there might be 10, 15 different live shows going on if it were a large enough city, and maybe 7 or 8 acts plus an orchestra at each show. So you can see where the demand was enormous. In fact, it exceeded the supply. And that's why variety acts at that time traveled so much, because all the local acts in a city might be booked somewhere, and they would need, let's say, a magician in Duluth or Mason City, and there wouldn't be anybody for 500 miles around. So they'd have to reach way, way out to Cleveland or Dallas or somewhere and ask, one agent would call another agent, say, who do you have? And if somebody was available, then they would drive that whole ways and do the show. And that's why we were on the road so much, and why my father was on the road so much, and why the business involved so much sleep deprivation.
Yeah, I just found that to be kind of the meat of what I was reading, and that is the passion that he had despite whatever that it took. I mean, when he was performing in Mexico and then had to drive all the way straight to Duluth without any sleep, day and night for whatever it was.
Trailer.
And that was not unusual, apparently.
No, it wasn't. I mean, nobody thought anything of it. I mean, other acts that we knew, I mean, they did it all the time.
And back then it was like $50 for a show or something. It's like, yep, that's worth driving.
Yeah, about that. 20 to $50 was just about standard. Sometimes a little more, depending on the situation. But you could work a lot of shows if you were willing to drive all over creation.
Right. Yeah, going back to back. But it sounded like that from time to time, like when you were working some of the, I guess, harvester shows, farming, county fairs and things like that, that it was a little bit longer, so you got to stay for a week or so.
Sometimes, yes. If we were pulling the trailer, we might park it in one central place, say Fargo or Bismarck, and then radiate out from that until it got too far, and then we'd move the trailer and spot it somewhere else. Other times we just move the trailer from town to town. It got to be a logistical problem carrying that big piece of furniture behind the car all the time.
Well, speaking of that, I was wondering how many times did you actually have to change out the car? Because the trailer would kind of last for a couple of decades, I guess, but the car itself, I could imagine that your father had to be a pretty good car mechanic.
Well, yeah, he bought a new car every year. It was worn out just from sheer mileage and also strain from pulling the trailer.
Sure.
So every year it'd be a new car. First thing he did was put on a hitch and throw away the back seat.
Wow. And so did your mom have anything to say as far as the selection of the car, or it's kind of like, well, this is just something that you had the same car every year, same model? I mean, same.
Yeah, he had, let's see, early cars were Hudsons, and then I can't remember, maybe it was an Oldsmobile, and then later on in his career, after my parents were divorced, he drove only Buick Rivieras for quite a few years. I don't know if she had much say in buying the car. I don't think so. To him, it was just like buying a mule or a horse, and he'd just go down and
right.
trade and get the best deal he could, and he didn't care what color it was or anything, and just drive it off the lot and keep going. It was going to be junk in a year anyway.
Right. Now, your mother, who was traveling with him, you said, and later got a divorce, but your brother Jerry, was she his mother also, both your mother?
No, two different mothers.
That's what I was thinking. Jerry was your older brother from a different mother.
Oh, yeah, my older half-brother. He was 16 years older than me,
Mm-hmm.
and I only met him once. So he was like a dark kind of secret in my father's past.
Huh. Yeah, when I read that, I thought there was going to be more about him because I thought it was interesting. Sound like he was a test pilot, back in the times when those guys were heroes.
Yeah, that's right. He flew at one time. He was the fastest man in the world in an airplane.
Mm-hmm.
Until the speed record was broken 2 weeks later. But he held a distinction for a while.
Yeah. So you really had a lot of admiration, I'm sure, for him. And so, yeah, that's interesting that your dad kind of kept that part of his life then separate from that. I want also to talk, about the man himself, about Jack Pyle and the kind of show. What was it that he actually did? Tell me about, the act. I mean, I know we're working with helping him to pack his doves and everything else that he was doing, but what was the meat of his show? Was it an 8-minute act, 12-minute silent act, or like Cardini with multiplying billiard balls, or was it more Channing Pollock? I mean, tell me something about the act.
Well, he did what he called a talking act. When acts were bought and sold by agents, that was a term used, silent act, talking act. And because he was a talking act, he was often MC. And he was a good speaker, cultivated his speech and elocution and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And he did about maybe early in his career after World War II, when he was doing the harvester shows and part of floor shows and variety shows, he would do maybe 12 minutes at the most, well, maybe 20 minutes at the most, but usually between 12 and 20 minutes. Card fans was a big thing in his act. His trademark was the rabbit production, he did a routine with the sympathetic silks, and then at the end he produced this huge rabbit, and he went to a lot of trouble to find the largest rabbit available, and then just feed the thing as much as it would eat until it grew to about 20 pounds. So when he pulled the thing out, I mean, it looked like he's holding a St. Bernard, up in front of a female stooge, and it was so surprising that very often, in fact, the desired result was that she would scream, put her hands up to her face with the utter surprise. And that was the big blow off, not just the switching of the knots or the pulling of the rabbit, but getting the reaction out of the. And later on, he did a memory stunt. He memorized a Saturday Evening Post. Passed the pages out in the audience, and they called out the numbers, and as fast as they could call them off, he told them exactly what was on the page. He did it very, very quickly. And then he did the substitution trunk with my mother, and that also he did very quickly. And that was the extent of his act, aside from a few smaller things. Once in a while, if he was working a kid show or something, he'd do a rope trick or the linking rings. Sucker egg. I think he even did Clippo for a while early on. I know I did when I first started. Mm-hmm. Later on in his career, he did more close-up, especially gambling moves, and I think that's what he was most known for.
Did he would do an expose of the gambling moves?
Well, he started off doing an expose, found that didn't sell really because nobody cared about that. But he did make it entertaining just by dealing 4 aces to anybody who wanted them, or dealing a bridge hand. Those kind of gambling tricks with cards. Sometimes he would use dice, and he would do some routines with the dice. And eventually, he did some mentalism effects. He wanted to transition over to doing mentalism. I think because he didn't want to carry as many props, which is why he got rid of the rabbit.
Was that after the divorce?
Yeah, it's after the divorce, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
One reason why he didn't do the rabbit anymore was because he was flying all over the country doing shows, and he couldn't get on the airplane with the rabbit. He used to just sneak the thing on board, but then they started looking in your luggage, for security reasons, and had too much trouble getting the rabbit on board, so he had to give that up. It was a lot easier if he could just get on an airplane with a deck of cards in his pocket and go anywhere he wanted. And then he could really travel light and travel fast and do a huge number of shows, which was the whole point to his career.
Sure. When did that start transitioning? At what point? I mean, how old were you at the time whenever that he had transitioned from pulling the trailer across the country to actually hopping in the plane?
Well, let's see. The trailer, we stopped pulling a trailer about the mid-1950s. He built a house out in the middle of a field. My mother didn't like the trailer for a whole number of reasons, and so he built a house in the middle of a field out in the suburbs of the Twin Cities. And that was hardly any better because there was no road leading to the house, and because he built it himself, it wasn't very sturdy. The wind whistled through the windows, shook, whenever the wind blew.
Which I guess you and your mom are used to because of that blizzard story.
Yeah. Well, at least she had a place to hang all her clothes. She wasn't cramped for space, but eventually that space got used up. So anyway, that was the end of the trailer. When they got divorced, then of course they no longer did the sub trunk, and then and that was 1960, and that happened. And then maybe around maybe around 1970, roughly, he stopped using the rabbit, and then it was just the deck of cards, and he would do stand-up comedy jokes on stage with the 5-card repeat or things like that. They didn't require a whole lot of weight to carry.
Mm-hmm. When I picture him in my mind, I think of someone like a David Niven type of a character with a thin mustache and a very dapper, debonair type of gentleman from the way that you've described him.
Yeah, he was like a matinee idol out of the 30s, and something that he, image he tried to cultivate. And as he got older, his hair was wavy and gray, and his mustache was gray, and he had this real distinguished look. And yeah, he was very much aware of that, and played it for all it was worth.
Yeah. Um, and I'm curious, I guess, that with what he has done. Oh, let me go back just a second. You had mentioned about the mentalism thing he was doing, where that he would have the Saturday Evening Post out there. So did he? There are different methods of doing that, and do you know, was that something that he actually did memorize, or was that something that was actually a trick?
Well, no, it was a trick. He used a mnemonic system,
Yeah.
and this was right after I think it was Bruno First had published a rather popular book on memory, how-to book on memory. I think it was maybe late 40s, early 50s, and somehow that inspired him to do this stunt on stage. So he had to put together a mnemonic system and then perfect it, and then start using it.
Right.
And the hard part, doing the stunt is one thing, but he had to always make sure he had the current issue of the Saturday Evening Post, because in those days it came out every week. And so the hard part was during that transition time from when the new issue came out. So sometimes you'd only have a few hours to memorize the new issue.
Right.
And then you forget the last week's issue, because that's what's most dominant in his mind, having done already, who knows how many shows with it that week. And then also just finding copies. I had that trouble myself when I did the same stunt on school assembly shows. If I was out in North Dakota and I needed 13 copies of Time magazine, boy, I would sometimes have to drive all over creation trying to find them. It wasn't easy. I'd have to sometimes filch them out of libraries or con the school librarian into giving me the current copy, which, of course, I'd have to tear up and pass out in the audience, and that didn't set me well with the librarian. But that's show business, what it takes.
Whatever it takes. No, that's true. No, I've always found that particular trick to be really good, and I remember seeing someone do that so many years ago, and the first time that I saw that, it just completely blew me away, because I knew that it was a current copy, and I understand mnemonics, and you have to hit on what I think is one of the hardest things, and that is that you have something in mind that you've been doing for a while, and to forget all of that and to relearn. I mean, you use the same system, but still there might be some words or something from week to week in which they're the same but a different page now, and so you got to remember what that would be. So I think forgetting is almost harder than learning.
That's right. Well, you can always construct a way to remember something, but you can't construct a way to forget something.
Right. And particularly whenever that after towards the end of the week that you've got that down pretty good, and it's kind of like, okay, we're starting all over again.
Yeah.
Very challenging. Well, why did you decide then that you were going to start to do magic when you said you were doing school shows and everything too, after what you had done as a child and being brought up and seeing that type of wanderer life? I'm surprised that appealed to you to the point it's like, that's just what I want to do.
Well, I never really wanted to go into show business or be a magician. I was more interested in being a scientist. Later on, I was interested in literature and in writing, and that's really my first passion. But I found that having grown up in this lifestyle of being confined to the back seat of a car and going to 30 elementary schools, 6 high schools, and 3 universities, and not ever getting a degree, made me so much of an outsider that I just could not fit into the straight world. I tried and assumed that I was part of it, but kept getting reminded to me that I was not. And so I was kind of looking around for something to do, and then during the Vietnam War, my brother was killed in action as a reconnaissance pilot in Vietnam. It was quite devastating to my father for a number of reasons that involved why he was kept such a secret from me. Very long story, but I go into it in the memoir. And so I was looking for just some way to distinguish myself so I wouldn't be a complete failure. And I came up with all kinds of cockamamie ideas, and none of them worked out. I tried to be a mail order, tried to start up a mail order shoe shine business, this ridiculous stuff like that.
What? Mail order shoe shine? They send their shoes in to be shined?
Yeah, that was my idea, but
Okay.
you can see that the level of practicality that I had.
Okay.
Growing up backstage in dressing rooms. So anyway, I decided, well, okay, I'll do my dad's act, and then I can work maybe a kiddie party every now and then, and at least show that I'm not a failure. Then he got the idea that, well, okay, this is great. I mean, this really perked him up. Now he wasn't so depressed over the loss of my brother. And he set up a audition for me in Chicago with school assembly service. And I was really nervous because, I had no skill at this, no interest, no, nothing. I just copied his act, the stuff that didn't require any dexterity.
Uh-huh.
His staging and the dramatic setup on these tricks, which is really what made them work for him. And much to my surprise, it worked for me too. And school assembly service hired me on a tour doing 36 weeks of schools, 10 to 13 shows a week. And so there I was, off and running. Last thing I wanted to do, but there I was doing it.
And so there again, I guess that you started getting that kind of experience. It's like this, you're starting to get into a groove, and I can do this.
Well, sure. I mean, nothing will carve you faster than the baptism of fire, especially with schools. Because back in those days, the kids were a little different than they are today. Now they're a little more zombied out because of TV and the internet and so forth. We didn't have that stuff back then. And so they were far more energetic and far more of a control problem, let's say, unless you really knew how to work them, especially in high schools. And so I learned very, very quickly.
Well, for an example, what did you do? How did you start to control audiences back then, and how did you see that evolve?
Well, the first thing I learned was that you got to speed things up. You got to stay at least 2 steps ahead of them. Another is that you can't come across appealing to their sense of respect for you, because it's not there. And the more you try to do that, it's like the sharper their teeth get.
Mm-hmm.
I cultivated a little, a sense of aloofness. Somebody else might have done it differently, but, it's what I did. So I speeded things up, did that, and then used the old tricks of audience participation and making that participation contingent upon them behaving in a certain way. Mm-hmm. And the timing of everything got better and better the more I did it. I tape recorded every show. I listened to every show on tape, zeroed in on those things that I thought needed improving, and eventually I got pretty good.
Now, you mentioned high schools as well as elementary schools. So when you did those shows, did you see a lot of times that the ages were mixed in those larger groups, or were they different?
Oh, yeah. Very often it was a K through 12. In fact, most often it was, because these are tours out in the boonies, small towns. I didn't get into large cities at all, because school assemblies just didn't happen in large cities for a bunch of reasons. But they were small towns usually, and K through 12 was pretty much standard, unless it was a high school. And even then, they would sometimes throw in the junior high, the 8 through 12. And so that was a little hard, because you try to appeal to the high schoolers, and then the first graders have no idea what's going on. You appeal to the first graders, and the high schoolers are bored with doing stuff for kids. So you had to kind of finesse things back and forth with each one. I found that it was easier to play to the high schoolers and let the younger ones come up than to try to play to the younger ones and let the high schoolers come down.
Good advice. Yeah, I think that kids in general are not given enough credit for their intelligence, and a lot of times adults, particularly getting started working for children, will start to play down to them and then quickly realize that they're eating you alive because they understand what's going on.
That's right. That's a very good phrase because I mean the actual feeling is like being in the Amazon River with piranhas, at your toes and working their way up.
Did you also, so were you booked by an agent? You had said that, I guess, whenever your dad had taken you there to begin with, and so they liked you, and so they started booking you. Did you use the same agent? Did you have different ones, or how did that go about getting booked for all those? I know there are different ways of doing that, and there are phone room shows and all that as well, but how did you get booked?
Well, for me, I always worked through school assembly agency. Later on, I started booking them myself direct and found that I could do fewer shows but for more money. And that was when I started doing hypnotism. School assembly agencies would not book hypnotism shows for some reason. It was just, I don't know, it was like something taboo.
Well, that persists to this day as well. I recall some recent years ago that I was doing something for high school lock-in or project graduation or something. And actually, I take that back. My son was in high school and he was graduating, and I was on the entertainment committee, and I had suggested to the committee that we have a hypnotist. And there were several of the members who were saying, "Oh no, we don't want to have our kids clucking like chickens for 2 weeks." And it's like they're still believing that. And so that was I finally got through, and the person was a success. But yeah, I know that it's sometimes difficult to book those kinds of shows or acts.
Yeah, yeah. Well, my father never worked school assemblies, or very rarely worked them, and never worked through school assembly agencies. His shows were adult shows. He worked things like the Playboy clubs, Copacabana, things like that. A lot of resorts, as well as banquets and so on. Once in a great while, he'd work for kids, but not very often. And he didn't really have a kiddie act. It was kind of funny to watch him try to work for kids because he had a kind of a set routine, and some of his jokes were definitely, although they weren't off color, they kind of referred to drinking or something like that, and he'd kind of forget and let the jokes slip out.
It was more appropriate for the burlesque shows that he did.
Yeah. It was like maybe a little inside thing with whatever adults happen to be in the audience.
Right. Now, did he have several agents that he worked with then as well, or did he have one that was booking him exclusively?
Well, he worked through the Charles Hogan. He was managed by the Charles Hogan Agency in Chicago for probably the last maybe 60, 70, maybe the last 20 years of his career. And then they would work through agencies all across the country. Up until that time, he also worked through agents in various cities, as did all variety acts, probably 15 or 20 agents at least. And you were always trying to get agents interested in coming out to see your show. If you happen to be in a city where you didn't know any agents, you'd contact them and tell them you were at such and such a place and have them come out and see the act, and hopefully they'd book you.
And so when an agent would come out and see you and then book you, you still had to say, well, I'm represented by XYZ agency, and so they would be the ones who would be getting a fee. So he had to pay double fees, I guess, basically.
That's true. When he was managed by, actually Marcus Glazer was the manager at the Charles Hogan Agency. That was a problem. Because we 220% commissions, and that's a pretty hefty bite.
Not much left on the bone, on the meat there, or not much meat left on the bone after that.
Right.
Wow. And so in traveling around, by the way, you're probably, I don't know if you stayed in a particular area. It sounded like that your dad was really traveling coast to coast and border to border and everything. Did you, when you were performing, stay in a certain area? I mean, I'm thinking, for an example, of J.B. Bobo in the South, who worked Texas and a lot of the southern areas, mainly in school shows. And so did you work in one area or ever come into contact with or cross paths like with Bobo or others?
I worked mostly in the Midwest.
Mm-hmm.
When I was working through agencies. I would sometimes get into Texas if I was doing school assemblies. I'd book them myself. I also worked, when I started working colleges, I would try to side book some school shows in Texas. I also worked nightclubs on the West Coast, and I would try to work a school show during the day, and do the nightclub at night.
Mm-hmm.
I seldom ran into other performers on school assemblies. I mean, for all the hundreds and hundreds of them I did, there would be no reason why I would cross paths with them, because the idea was to space us out.
Sure.
Sometimes be a couple of weeks ahead or behind of another act. I know Dick Osland was a real big school assembly act, and he was always 2 or 3 weeks distant from me, ahead or behind, and we knew of each other. And we tried to link up a couple of times, but it was always where one or the other of us was a day late. We just couldn't quite do it. And I finally did meet him for the first time after years and years of knowing who he was. And that was only just a couple of years ago, 3 years ago. So, and of course, we talked about school assemblies, and we had a lot of that in common.
Right. Right. As I was thinking also, I believe Virgil and Birch worked some school assemblies, I think.
Yes.
Way back when.
Yeah, there were a lot of school assembly acts. It was almost like harvester show acts, because there were school assembly agencies in various sections of the country, and they would have 15 different acts on tour, at any one time.
Now, we dropped that word harvester show in here a couple of times during this episode, and so explain exactly what was a harvester show.
Well, after World War II, International Harvester, they made farm implements, would hold, I guess, what you would call a trade show in small towns, in the local gymnasium or the local theater, and the show would be free. And it was a variety show with maybe 6 acts. That somebody played the accordion as backup music. And people would come down to see the free show, and then there'd be card tables in the back of the room with brochures and things of hay balers and harrows and tractors and those sort of things. Sometimes they would show a movie before the show in which they'd promote their product, and then the show would take place. Mm-hmm. And this happened in small towns all over the country. I mean, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of towns. And they would have these circuits of performers doing variety shows, and just scores and scores of entertainers, all traveling a different town almost every day. 6, 7 shows, or 6, 7 different towns a week was just about average. So there was a lot of traveling involved.
Plus, it sounded like that you crossed paths with a lot of the same entertainers on a lot of the same shows, like the whipcracker and the ventriloquist and singers and dancers.
Yeah, shows were usually the same acts on every show.
Ah.
All other shows, it was like a roulette wheel. You never knew who you were going to meet. Eventually, you'd meet everybody sooner or later, but harvester shows was the same group of people that traveled together. And then every year you'd be matched up or part of a show with different people.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting that most people don't recognize the difficulties that the child of a traveling performer would have, specifically, as you alluded to there earlier, about the many schools that you had gone to, in which that, like your dad said, when, it's like, okay, follow these, when we go to the trailer park, follow those kids to school, wherever the school is. I don't know where it is, and kind of follow them home or whatever. And so you'd make some friends for the day or week, perhaps. And then, as you said, that in some schools, it's interesting that you could note that you were ahead or behind in different schools, and because their curriculums were different and different agendas, I guess, in the schools. So it was kind of interesting.
Yeah, well, the very few kids traveled with their parents because if there was more than one kid, it was just too much to handle. One kid might be okay because you're just an only child and you wouldn't be involved with a sibling and all that involves. Usually they were left at home. The mother would be oftentimes in a trailer park somewhere, sometimes a house, but I didn't run into any other kids really the whole time I was growing up. But since my mother worked in my father's act, we all had to travel together. And so I learned very early to really contain myself in the dressing room, because nobody wants a kid making trouble in the dressing room right before a show.
Right, so you were pretty much invisible, and in particular, like when you were working the burlesque shows and the ladies were coming in and out, and of course you were a youngster at the time and just trying to blend in and not be seen.
That's right. Yeah, I got pretty good at it too. One time I was in the dressing room and we're on a show with Hank Williams, and I'm sitting in the dressing room just blending into the woodwork, and Hank Williams comes in and sits down, and he's drinking from a bag. He's got something in there, and for the longest time he's just sitting there kind of staring into space, taking a swig from the bottle in the bag. And I don't know how long it was, a long time, 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes. He looks up and suddenly he realizes I'm there. He's by himself. And he just took a little chuckle, at the absurdity of it, and then ignored me and went back to taking swigs from his bag until, he had to leave the room for some reason.
But never acknowledged you, never said, "Hey, kid," or anything?
Yeah, no, it didn't say a word. I mean, almost never did anybody say anything to me.
Well, along that line, it's an interesting story. Can you share 2 or 3 other kind of highlights or something that maybe from the book or something that after the book was written, it's like, oh, this would have been a good one to include?
Well, let's see. I think I included most of the ones that were the best ones.
Yeah.
I think probably the one of the strangest people that we traveled with was a man named Tom Gary. He was kind of a legend in his own time among entertainers because he was so eccentric and always getting into some kind of trouble or another. He married a woman when she was in a hypnotic trance in Seattle, and her parents called the police, and there was a big scandal over that. Another time he turned a coyote loose in a hotel lobby, and that got in the news and made a big splash locally.
Wow.
One of his stunts was he did a whip act, among other things. And he took out this great big long bullwhip and he cracked the thing, and it made such a loud noise. It was like a cherry bomb going off. And he'd get a volunteer. I don't know how much of a volunteer it was, but he pulled somebody up on the stage, a bald man, and put a dime on the bald man's head, and then bullwhip the dime off the top of the guy's head.
Wow.
So everybody is just terrified, because it looks so dangerous. But actually the whip would crack way off to one side, and then it would just come around and brush the dime off. It wasn't that the business end of the whip was actually hitting the dime.
Uh-huh.
But nobody saw that. Well, every so often he'd get too low with the whip, and the thing would wrap around the guy's face. And it didn't, it was harmless. It didn't do anything, but it just looked really bad. And afterwards, occasionally the volunteer would come back to the dressing room and say, yeah, I came a little low with that whip there, don't you think? Gary would never, ever admit to doing anything wrong. And he'd say, if I'd have come low with that whip, I'd have taken your head clean off. I just remember him saying that I don't know how many times.
Yeah, well, obviously that had an impact on you because in one of the stories over there that when you were at a school and you're supposed to draw a picture and everyone was drawing pictures of a neighbor and you didn't know what a neighbor is or a basement or different kinds of things, but the fact that they had you drew a picture of this whip around this guy's head, and of course the teacher couldn't understand, and so she pinned that to you to take home to your parents.
Yeah, that's right. That's just one of a long series of miscommunications between my worldview and everyone else's.
Yeah, I think, when particularly you're a child, that you just see a myopic vision of the world, and you might get some sort of an outside idea by talking with other children, and that but you become friends with them. In this case, that you really didn't get a chance to have friends with people for very long, so you couldn't have really a relationship. So it was hard to kind of understand what other kids were experiencing, and the same thing with what they were trying to wrap their heads around, the entertainment business of whenever that you would show up, even though that at that time, as you said, there were so many people who were traveling about, but they weren't traveling with kids. I think, nowadays, I would liken that perhaps to cruise ship magicians who might bring their children on board, in which they are there, but as they are being schooled, they could be schooled by their parents, and then at some point think that they come on land, or that they give them to the children to the parents or grandparents or someone to help bring them for a while, or that perhaps that the wife may stay on land for a while, and then eventually that the man will come on land also and kind of go into something else that will allow him to stay at home more. So I know that that's a very difficult decision when you go to sea and then you get married and then have a child, that it's hard to bring up a child in that cruise ship environment. And then I'm sure for that child to come back into the real world when they're used to being at sea all the time and they don't understand what's going on. So like I remember whenever I was, my older son was quite young, and I was living in a small town, and I had been on television and the newspapers and a lot of things with my magic and performing, but a few weeks had gone by and there hadn't been anything on television or in the newspaper, and my son asked me if my job was okay. He said, I haven't seen you, any of the publicity or anything, and so I want to make sure that you're doing okay, because he thought that was his myopic view of the world, basically, again, that everyone else's parents must be doing well, and they're in the newspaper also, and how come you haven't been in there for a while?
That's right. Well, it's whatever you're used to. That's your world that you're familiar with.
Right.
If you grew up in a Congo and back in the jungle somewhere, that you're perfectly comfortable there. But
exactly.
You go to the big city, it's a much different story. Or if you and I were to go to someplace in the jungle in the Congo, we'd find ourselves in a strange environment.
Why do you think it is that your father, Jack Pyle, was not as well known, if really at all, among the rest of the magicians? I mean, I know that he wasn't going to magic conventions and things like some others are, or working the Magic Castle or whatever, but still, he was working at a lot of these other popular venues that you had mentioned, the Playboy Club, etc., that would have put him in a light where that other magicians would have crossed paths. So I'm surprised that there's not as much talk about him or history that you can find about Jack Pyle.
There's probably not much you can actually find. You can go on the internet, and there's some video of his work later on with Ed Marlowe, Jack Codell, and people like that. He actually was at the Magic Castle a number of times. He was mostly interested in using magic as a way to make a living. So he was very, very busy doing shows. And during those brief periods that he wasn't doing shows, he was taking care of other things. So he just didn't have time to be involved in the magic world. He was fairly well known, I think, among magicians of that era, especially in Chicago. Everybody knew who he was.
Was he part of the Chicago Magic Roundtable?
I don't think he was part of it, but I'm sure they all knew who he was.
Yeah.
Maybe he participated with that. I don't know. But he was part of Ed Marlowe's Knights of Sleights, and was over there, for those meetings. And of course, he was at Jay Marshall's all the time for one reason or another. Mm-hmm. Jay and Francis used to have a Thanksgiving dinner for what they called waifs and orphans. People who didn't have a family or anywhere else to go. And there was a number of magicians, Berger, what's his name?
Eugene Berger.
Eugene Berger, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking Bernstein. And another thing. Anyway, and he was always one of them. So they all kind of knew who he was, but he was on the margins. He was on the outskirts of everything, and quite an outsider. And that's probably why.
And he was fine with that, it sounds like. He wasn't really looking for notoriety.
Yeah, he didn't really care. All he cared about was how many shows he could do, how much money he could make, and that was his entire focus.
What do you think is his legacy?
His legacy. As a magician?
Yeah, as a magician, I guess. What had he left behind, that people would be talking about? I assume, obviously, you, because you mean your legacy in which that you are performing and going out and doing magic then as well. But
Yes. Well, I think people might remember, the people who do remember him. I interviewed Jim Steinmeier a few years back for a magazine in the UK, and Steinmeier remembered my father in Chicago, and what he remembered was the magazine memorization.
hmm
I think a lot of people who do remember him will remember that. They would remember the Big Rabbit production because the way he did it and the way he set it up, it was just so dramatic. And after that would be maybe his close up with cards, because it was not necessarily all that technically proficient, but psychologically he did his effects in such a way that they got just enormous reaction. People would just literally be on the floor.
So it was his presentation, but nothing that he had necessarily invented like Marlowe had.
Yeah, right. Yeah, nothing like Marlowe. The two were like night and day in terms of how they approached cards, but they appreciated each other because Marlowe never performed and probably couldn't get very far if he did. But he was a genius when it came to coming up with moves and so forth. And so my father admired that. And if he could learn a little something here, a little something there, that he was satisfied with that.
Had either your dad or you thought about getting into trade shows? Because it was around that time when they were getting popular.
Yeah, well, he was quite big in trade shows.
Okay.
And worked quite a few of them. And that's when he started flying all over the country, just with a deck of cards.
Mm-hmm.
And I know Don Allen was real big in trade shows then too.
Right.
And they kind of maybe the two trade show magicians in Chicago, pretty much as far as I'm aware. And between the two of them, they did just about all the trade shows that there were.
Yeah, I remember that Bud Dietrich was another one who was very involved. There were a few guys, back there, and Dick Ryan.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I recognize those names. Mm-hmm.
Right. What year did he pass?
1987.
In 87. And that was from, I'd forgotten.
Lung cancer.
Cancer, I was thinking. Yeah. Okay. Was he a heavy smoker? I didn't recall reading much about him smoking.
He was a heavy smoker until about 1955, 56.
Mm-hmm.
And a very heavy smoker up until then, and then he quit cold turkey, just on sheer stubborn willpower.
Mm-hmm.
And so he hadn't smoked for the last remaining years of his life, but yet he died of lung cancer anyway.
My father-in-law as well had quit like 30 years earlier, but still died of lung cancer later. Mm-hmm.
He had a half brother. Strange how history repeats itself. Who was also kind of a secret person in the family. He only met him, I think, once or twice. He was never brought up or talked about. And he was worked in the circus. He was a pitchman. He was known as Chief Lighthawk. And he was a heavy smoker, and he died of lung cancer. And so after that happened, my father decided, well, I'm going to quit smoking, so that won't happen to me.
Mm-hmm.
So there you are.
Yeah, interesting. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you kind of giving us some background, a lot of insight into the book. Again, it's called Master of Deception, and this will be available then through Amazon, or how can people get copies of this?
Yeah, you can get it anywhere, any bookstore, Amazon, online, anywhere you like, directly from the publisher.
Do you plan to eventually have an Audible book of this as well?
An audio book is released simultaneously.
Oh, it is? Absolutely. Okay, interesting, because I know sometimes it's sometime after a book is released that they actually do that, so that's being done simultaneous.
Yeah.
Interesting. And the website where people could go if they want to look to find out more information aside from Amazon, is there a website set up?
Yes, just go to Rare Bird Books, and it'll be one of their books, Rare Bird Books.
Okay. And were they someone that you had worked with before? You said that you had this other book prior to that you had written, or did they approach you? Or you go to them because you'd already done a book with them before?
No, the first book, the publisher approached me. He just heard about it and approached me. Second book was handled by the Chase agency in New York, and they submitted the book to Rare Bird.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Well, as we close, the last thing that I always like to ask my guests is, because the name of my podcast is called The Magic Word, what is it that's your philosophy of life? I mean, you've certainly had a lot of experiences. I enjoyed reading about them and hearing them directly from your lips. So tell me, what is it that perhaps you've learned, or something that you live by that's important to you every day? It doesn't have to be a word. It could be a phrase or some mantra, whatever that you...
Well, what always comes to my mind when this topic comes up is the words of Socrates, who said the unexamined life isn't worth living. And so the more you examine your life and all that life involves, then the more rich it becomes. And
Wow.
That's pretty much the way I live.
That's great. Boy, I can tell that you do. That's interesting. That's a really good one as well. So I'm going to close with that, and thank you very much, John, again for your time.
Thank you, Scott.
And good luck with the book. And until next time, that was the author of Master of Deception, John Ivan Palmer. And this is Scotty out. Thank you, John, for being my guest on this week's episode of the Magic Word Podcast. And thank you for bringing to light and into focus someone who I was not as familiar with, your father, Mr. Jack Pyle. And I hope that the magicians also will learn something from this then as well. This has been great. If you'd like to learn how that you can get a copy of this, perhaps win a free copy, all you need to do is to go to themagicwordpodcast.com, and there you will see a form that you can complete with your name and email address, and that will populate an Excel spreadsheet, and I will select 2 random winners, and that we will send that out to you. Now, let me point out that this is just for domestic shipping only, so this is available only to U.S. residents. If you live outside the U.S., you can still enter. However, that if you happen to be a winner, then I will notify you as to what that postage is going to be to send it foreign shipping, but typically it is quite a bit. So anyhow, if you elect not to pay for foreign shipping, then I'll go back and draw another name, and we'll go from there. And also, let me point out that simultaneous this week, there is another contest that is running. That was from last week. That was with Jamie Salinas, in which that he had a download of a video that is available of his system on perfect personality readings with him and Paul Draper. And so there are 2 different forms. And so if you didn't complete the form from last week for the prize package we're giving away, 2 of them from Jamie Salinas, you can sign up this week at this week's blog for episode number 572, in which that you can sign up both for an opportunity to win the copy of a book, Master of Deception, and for a copy of the transfer of the video for the perfect personality readings from Jamie. Anyhow, I think you get the general idea. Also, while you're there, you can also sign up for our weekly pod letter, and be sure to do that so that way that you're in the know. You know all about the contest we have coming up, and also who's going to be on this week, who's coming up next week. And so, speaking of next week, I think I'll see you next week. So until then, stay well, get booked, and remember that if you examine your life and all that life involves, then the more rich it will become. This is Scotty out.